I would like to talk very briefly about the family, because we all come from families, and many of us construct our own families at some point in our lives. And yet, while individual decisions and life paths should always be respected, there is an alarming trend in Western society where we seem to turn away from the family. This can be seen in all kinds of, at all levels, such as, parents losing the respect of their children, and young people proudly declaring that they won't reproduce. And my question is, how did we as a society come to distrust one of our fundamental institutions, and what is the role of politics in all of this? I come from Hungary, and many of you know that that's a former socialist country. Abortion was legalized by the Soviets for us, and this happened a little bit earlier than in most Western societies. And of course, the Soviets didn't do it because they were such great believers in women's rights or women's liberation or individual freedoms. No, they simply wanted women to join the workforce and work low-paid jobs such as factory work. The current Hungarian government is doing something quite different. They made the support of families as one of their priorities. And the idea behind is quite simple. If we accept that we are free to choose our path in life, then that should mean that if somebody desires to have a family, which could be even a large family, such as 3 or more children, then finances should not be an obstacle. So nobody should be condemned to poverty just because they want to have children. And a couple of measures that the Hungarian government is taking, some of them are financial incentives. So, for instance, you can get tax exemptions and interest-free loans to buy a new house or a car or renovate your house. And another type of measure is the protection of families. And the key thing to that is giving the authority to parents to raise their kids the way they see fit, without politics and other institutions talking into it. Thankfully, these measures are very successful. Yes, they're showing up in the statistics, even though they've been in place for only a couple of years. But year by year, we have more marriages, more children being born, and people from countries like the US and France are coming to learn from us Hungarians about family policy. And yet, Europe is not happy about it. So my questions are, why is that? How is it possible that in Europe, where every single country is suffering from declining demographics, and we're heading towards catastrophe in that sense, the one country that's trying to do something to stop it, or slow it down at the very least, is being attacked. And so that raises the question also, should education and family policy be decided at national level, or is it something that should be decided at supranational level? And which one is more democratic? So tonight we have 2 speakers with us. The first is Ashley Frawley. She's a sociologist and a visiting research fellow with MCC Brussels. She's written 2 books. Her main focus is family and policy focus on the family. She's a defender of family autonomy. And her recent study just came out yesterday. It's available in the MCC Brussels website, and it's called Families in Fragments. And after Ashley, we're going to have Nátalia Borza, who's a linguist from Pázmány, Péter Catholic University. She's written studies on gender-neutral pronouns, and a more recent one on the first Hungarian children's book that introduces the concept of gender to young children. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ashley.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So the concept of gender has a very interesting and perhaps somewhat sordid history. A concern for women's rights and women's issues obviously emerged as far back, well, you can take concern back as far as you like, but during the Enlightenment, you famously had John Stuart Mill and other figures who talked about women's issues. And then towards the mid-20th century, we had a rising concern for women in policy that, as more and more women entered the workplace, there were concerns about how you would manage these sorts of things, women's rights, And part of it was the biology of women. The fact that women have babies meant that you needed to have something in place that allowed for the comfort of the mother and her baby away from work for a certain period of time. But these movements didn't use the word gender. The word gender initially comes from obviously linguistics, but it started to be used within the context of sex in discussions of intersexuality in psychology. So, for example, in the United States, there were clinics that emerged in the 1960s that were in California that were concerned about a variance between what they saw as feminine boys and masculine girls and their sex. And this didn't come from any kind of feminist outlook. The role of this clinic was to align, to get people to give certain therapies that would align feminine boys and masculine girls with their natal sex, to get them to behave in ways that the clinicians anyway thought were appropriate for their sex. But the word gender then moved into feminist work as a replacement for what had been discussed as sex roles. And unlike the psychologists, feminists used it to argue for the undesirability of particular gender roles. That there was nothing, just like the psychologists, well, they argued that there was nothing natural about particular sex roles, or gender roles. Just because someone has a particular sex doesn't mean that they will naturally take on these roles. And it was used as a way to fight for women's equality. And after that, into the 1980s, gender became a shorthand for women's issues. And so what happened was gender, as a more expansive concept now, including the long-forgotten gender identity of the 1960s, has come back into policymaking through the doors that were opened by the institutionalization or the use in policy of gender as gender equality. So that's one of the first things that happened, although it's not the only thing that happened. And so as institutions became more concerned about gender, they institutionalized women's rights via the language of gender. But by the 1990s, this began to seem a little bit stale. And policymakers who were interested in equality were looking for something new. And they were receptive, therefore, to what were at the time LGBT groups, who wanted to open up the equalities agenda to gay and lesbian rights. And so there was this inroad that was created there when gender didn't seem sexy. Gender as a women's rights issue didn't seem all that sexy. And so there was a move toward gay and lesbian rights. And then as this agenda progressed, again, it happened that once it seemed as though gay and lesbian rights had made significant inroads, they had achieved their legislative aims, again, there was an appetite for something new. And this led to a receptivity to the gender side of the LGBTIQ continuum. Because initially, LGB was concerned about sexuality, and obviously TIQ and so on was interested in gender identity. And this wasn't frictionless. In fact, the difference between a concern for sexuality and a concern for gender identity caused some problems within the gay rights movement itself. For instance, in the United States, ENDA, an act that had been in development for 30 years, was effectively vetoed in 2007 when advocates for gender identity wanted to add something about identity into the act. So this was legislation that would enshrine gay and lesbian rights, gay, lesbian, and bisexual rights in the United States for the first time. And it had been developing for 30 years. And then in a short space of time, people who wanted a more expansive concept of gender identity were able to put in some lines that also included them without very much debate about this. So of course it went to, this became very controversial and this stalled the policy. And people who were interested in sexuality were kind of annoyed. They said, we've been fighting for this for 30 years and you've effectively vetoed the policy. Not everybody. Obviously, there were the fact that it was vetoed was because the LGBT groups refused to support it if the gender lines were removed. But anyway, so this more expansive concern for gender was sort of tacked on to LGBT movements as they became more successful. So Stonewall, for instance, in the UK, was very successful in getting their legislative changes that they wanted, and therefore they were receptive to the growing trans agenda, the growing gender identity agenda, and they foregrounded it in what they were doing. And then, of course, when it came to gender, another example from the UK, there was a decision to set up a group about gender. It was it would be focused on women's issues. This came out of some debates in an all-party group. And so they set up this gender group. And it was supposed to be about women. That was the initial thing. And I'm not saying it should only be about women, but it's interesting that it was initially about women. And one of the first reports that came out was about gender identity. And so these sort of inroads were made through piggybacking on existing policy and bundling more expansive concerns for gender onto policies that were much more, that had much more public purchase, that people in the public were more or less in favor of. So in some countries, gender self-identification, making it easier for people to change their gender and to have certification of this was bundled into gay rights legislation and gay marriage, which most people were in favor of. And if you look at reports produced by activist groups, for instance, a report put out in 2019 by Iglio and Reuters called Only Adults, they talk about how it's a report reviewing years of activism. And what's interesting about that is how over and over, they self-consciously talk about how policies have to be changed, or policies are more effective the more they subvert public debate. The less that the public or the media debates things, the better. And they talk about how they were most successful in changing the policy in countries where there was the least attention, where they were able to, as I said, piggyback their concerns onto agendas that had a lot more purchase, that most people agreed with. And this is kind of why a lot of people were blindsided when gender began to mean something else. And it seemed to be, sometime around 2017, 2018, this agenda appeared to emerge fully formed, already institutionalized into policy or about to be institutionalized. So for instance, in the UK, very quickly, there was an announcement on behalf of the then Prime Minister Theresa May that a streamlined process for gender self-identification of changing one's gender was going to be introduced without very much public debate. And in fact, women's groups have expressed surprise that this had happened. And they weren't even aware that it was going on. And so so it was already on the agenda, already something that was going to happen before anybody really knew it was happening. And the reason for that is because, as I said, they expressly sought to subvert public opinion. So why do that? Why seek covert pathways to policy? And I think part of the reason is that if you see the public as part of the problem, rather than a constituency that needs to be convinced, then the public becomes the outcome of your policy, not the pathway to the policy. And so what happened was, rather than what we might assume is the ideal of democracy, where you seek to change people's minds in order to change a policy, part of the movement was to change policy to change people's minds. And so within this, institutions became key targets of activism. So one of the pathways for policy, for social change that activist groups and NGOs targeted was sex education. And they found an open door because generally Teachers didn't want to teach this. They felt that they had to. And so these NGOs and activist groups offered to come in and give these sort of packages and teach this education. And this was important because the idea was that you could change people's ideas about gender identity, not just in terms of like a huge range of identities, whatever they might be, but also in terms of gender stereotyping, which policymakers have long seen as an impediment to the policies that they want. For example, dual earner families as a driver of economic growth. When there are impediments to that, the idea is, well, it's gender stereotyping that's stopping women from going out into the workplace as much as we would like them to. So gender stereotyping in general is seen as an issue, and education is seen as a key inroad. So you have to get children as young as possible and kind of shake all the bad stereotypes out of them. And then you will, from the bottom up, kind of grow the kinds of policies or outcomes that you want. But this was, for at least for activists for a more expanded concern for gender that wanted to go in and teach sex education, this was a double-edged sword. Because sex education is famously what we call a position issue. It's very controversial. People cannot agree about what, whether, and how you should teach sex education of any kind. And so going in and teaching concepts of gender that are very much at variance with what most people think, right or wrong, was bound to cause controversy. And this, in fact, is one of the first places where people encountered this agenda for the first time, when they found that it was being taught in schools. And this created a huge amount of backlash. So that's just one example of this attempt to kind of go in using covert means to make a change that then had a negative effect. Because what happens is, when you use policy, when you have, well, I think at the base of this, the base of all of this, we have a conflict over values. Although it is communicated through the language of rights, and there are certainly some rights issues, at the core of the gender debate are values. As a woman, what should you do? What does that mean? As a man, what should you do? What does that mean? As a human being, what should you do? Really deep questions about what it means to be human. Things that people are going to struggle over. We call this a value conflict. And the outcome of a value conflict can go in three directions. You can bargain, you can give and take. You give a little and you get a little. Abortion policy is a good example of this in the UK. Nobody quite got what they wanted, but there's a sort of tacit agreement. It's not affirmed. You don't get abortion on demand just as a value in the culture and in policy. There are, checks and balances and so on. But it effectively works for people who want abortion. Yes, they want something more extreme, but they have accepted this sort of tacit kind of agreement. That's bargaining. Okay. And it kind of works more or less. There's still debate that will go on, but it functions, and we're able to live together more or less peacefully on this particular issue until it erupts on the public agenda again. But this is a policy that results from bargaining. The second is consensus. When you put your values on the table and we debate them, we can reach a consensus. And the third is naked power. You just crush the opposition. And I think what's happening more and more with policy is activists and NGOs and lobby groups and so on opt for a naked power approach through these kinds of covert means. And they adopt what the sociologist Joseph Gusfield calls a coercive reform. And coercive reform is when you can't trust a group, your target group, to hold your values, and you think there's no point in trying to convince them your values are not the values of society. So you seek to use law and reform to force those values onto people. And Gusfield is talking about the American temperance movement, prohibition. And he asked, why do people who, didn't live near drinkers care so much about other people's drinking? And he said because they were concerned that their values were not the values of the culture. And that's what it was really about. It was about affirming hard work and teetotaling and whatever as the values of the culture. So at least they knew people were going to break the rules, but they could sleep well in the knowledge that when they broke the rules, it was their rules that they were breaking. And I think a lot of activists know that society doesn't hold their values, but they can sleep well knowing that when people oppose these values, there's not really a debate happening. They're transgressing their values and norms that have now been affirmed by the culture. And I think that explains a lot of what's going on here, this desire to kind of circumvent democratic processes, to avoid debate, to have one's values affirmed as the values of the culture, whether or not people actually hold them. So that even when they are broken, even when people say, hey, I don't agree with that, there's not really a debate happening. You can simply reaffirm your values. But these are the values of the culture. See, I have it enshrined in law. I have it enshrined in policy. And I think generally this isn't good for anyone. This isn't good for policymaking. We live in complex, pluralistic societies. There are lots of values at play. And people are going to disagree about things. And you cannot simply circumvent that disagreement to use a naked power approach to crush other people's values. Because all that happens is when the opposition takes power or gets the upper hand, they crush you right back. And what we have are extremes. It's all or nothing. And activists have even said, again, going back to that Iglio report, activists even expressly said, there can be no bargaining. And they warn against gender activists from giving anything on their positions. But if there can be no bargaining and consensus, the only option is naked power. And that's going to come back to bite you. Because in our societies, policies need to have some kind of legitimacy. The exercise of power has to be legitimated. And if you make policies that have no democratic legitimacy, they will be overturned. They don't have longevity. And they're not good policies because they're not taking in the range of values at stake and trying to find a way through them. They're just trying to crush each other. And I think in terms of the family, what has happened here is in this process, the family has come to be seen as an impediment to these values, where the family is no longer something that, we have to understand and, think about the relationships between individuals, the cohesiveness, its comfort, things that really matter to the vast majority of people. Instead, this becomes an impediment to having those values affirmed by society. And so the family becomes this barrier, this annoying private institution that if we could just kind of get in, find some way around it, then we would win. Again, through this kind of coercive reform where you kind of force people to accept things. And this, in this context, family policy becomes self-evidently backward. Gender becomes a forward-looking, progressive movement, and the family is a backward-looking, regressive movement. And you can see this, the EU played with the idea of gender mainstreaming, gave it some affirmation, and now you have LGBTIQ mainstreaming that is celebrated, gender mainstreaming that is celebrated, and the family, any country that has a family policy, it's a cover for men's rights, or it's a cover for something else. And it might be, but you can have a family policy and it not be men's rights. Like, that's something that really matters to people. But now we can hardly even discuss the family, because now the family is backward and gender is forward. I don't think that's a society that most of us want to live in. That's all.
Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to take part in the discussion and to share some of the insights of my research. As Christina introduced, I'm a linguist, a social linguist, and I deal with controversial topics of present-day society. For example, I've analyzed opinions of social perception of populism and conspiracy theories, and I've been dealing with gender issues as well. So what I'm going to talk about today for you is some of the insights of a current discourse analytical research I was doing in the Hungarian context. So it's going to be a case study. It's not an overall picture as Ashley's was, but more focusing on the Hungarian situation. And the case I took is the first children's book about LGBTQ people in the Hungarian language, which came out back in 2020, and it's a collection, it's an anthology of 17 recast fairy tales. Recast here means that the good old traditional fairy tales were reimagined in such a way that there is a gender diverse character in them, and the setting is an inclusive setting. And the book was intended for childcare institutions, so kindergartens and primary school as well. It was intended as a teaching material for introducing the gender idea for children. But actually the target group, the age group wasn't specified, so what we know is it's a fairy tale collection for children. Now then, when the book was published in Hungarian, then in a very short time span, a petition was launched because people in Hungary got really angry, and there was a huge stir about the book, and civilians wanted to have the book removed from the bookstores, claiming that influencing children with political and sexual ideologies is against the interest of the children. So what we saw is that within 3 days, so very, very short time, more than 85,000 people signed the petition. Now then, my aim with the research was to see why people support and why people oppose to gender education for children. And I wanted to see the set of arguments on both sides to see what kind of framing and legitimization or delegitimization comes up in the topic. So what I did, I watched the video of the book launch and I collected all the comments which were posted to the video. So this way I could get the opinion of ordinary Hungarian people about gender education for children. Now then, not to make it boring for you, I'm not going to discuss the methodological part, the linguistic part of the topic. If anybody is interested, you can put it as a question, or after the discussion I can tell you details about that. But I think it's more interesting to talk about the results, the findings, why people find it reasonable or unreasonable to have gender education for children. But first of all, I'd like to show you, as Ashley has already touched upon, the idea that the word or the concept gender is a versatile one. It's not a firmly fixed concept, but it's something which is rather vague. And if you have a look at, for example, the definition of gender, which was given by the European Institution for Gender Equality, then you find a rather, I would say, mild definition, because it says that gender is the social attributes and opportunities which are associated with being male and female, and the relationships between women and men and girls and boys, as well as the relations between women and those between men. So what you see here is that basically there is no talk about sexuality, there is nothing about sexual orientation, and it doesn't talk about the idea of changing one's gender. But if you have a look at the definition of gender given by the WHO, the World Health Organization, then you will find something different, because they connect gender immediately with gender identity, and they say that gender identity refers to a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's physiology or designated sex at birth. So already the idea of discomfort comes up in this definition, and still what remains is the binary. So you've got male and female and nothing in between or outside the two. But if you visit Harvard Medical School, then you will find a completely different definition of gender, because they already introduced the ideas of the non-binary gender, when somebody's gender doesn't fit into the cultural norms or cultural categories of female and male. And they also talk about gender fluidity with their definition, where gender identity changes over time, and over time can be a very short time. So in the morning you feel like a woman, and in the evening you feel completely different. So if we have a look at how gender is not well defined, it's worth mentioning how in the very context gender was defined. So the book was published by an association which is called Labris in Hungarian, and this is an association for lesbian, bisexual, and trans women. They represent their interests, and in their definition that you can find on their website, and what you find actually in the fairy tale book as well, is that they don't restrict the idea of gender on the social roles of men and women, but rather they celebrate it as a proud realization of some of your chosen sexual identity, and it's focusing on sexual orientation and the free choice of sexual orientation as well. So when I collected the comments from the website, then this was the setting, and what you will see, gender equality is not going to be about equal payment for women, but a lot broader concept here. Now then, to show you some of the findings, first I will focus on the arguments on the side of the proponents of gender education for children. So why they want gender education to be introduced in our society, and then I will move on to the opposition. So the most frequently occurring topics within those who were proposing gender education for children was tolerance. Now then, tolerance is like a magic word these days, and it got a classical understanding though. In the original sense of the word, tolerance is something like the willingness to accept something, a belief that you disagree with, or accepting a behavior despite you disapprove of the behavior. And you acquiesce to this disagreement because you've got some common interest with the other person whose beliefs you disagree with or whose behavior you dislike. If you take the example, for example, of a teenager, of a cheeky teenager who is immodestly behaving with the parents and rude, then the parents can tolerate the child despite the impertinence of the teenager, because there is a sense of belonging together, there is a very strong sense of the family, and because of that common interest, the teenager's arrogance is tolerated. Now then, what you see in this example is that when we tolerate something, then we always are aware of what is irritating us or what is dislikable to us, and we make some sort of a cooperation despite the fact that we've got this feeling of discomfort with the other's belief or the other's behavior. But the use of the word tolerance among the supporters of gender education was completely different from the classical meaning of tolerance, because they never specified what should be tolerated. What they meant by tolerance was a universal and unconditional attitude, an attitude of acceptance. Now then, to give you a bit of linguistic hint why this could happen, is that the word tolerance is a noun which, a part of speech which defines a quality. And if you use the noun tolerance, then you don't need to give the object of the noun. So you can have the sentence, for example, with the previous example, that the parents showed tolerance, full stop, and you don't need to continue the sentence. It's going to be a complete sentence. But if you play around a bit with the language and change the part of speech, if you change the noun to a verb and you use tolerate, then immediately you need to fill something there, because the verb tolerate is a transitive verb, so it needs an object. So if you start your sentence like the parents tolerated, then you cannot stop here, you cannot put a full stop, you need to specify what the parents tolerated. So what I saw in the discussion, in this public debate, is that tolerance was typically used as a noun without any specification of what kind of behavior was tolerated and for what reasons. Now then, the other tricky thing with the use of the word tolerance was that it wasn't used in a reciprocal way. By which what I mean is that those who were proposing gender education for children expected tolerance from those who didn't like the idea of gender education from children. And it was as if they had a shield and they put the coat of arms on the shield, but it wasn't their embodied quality of being tolerant painted as a coat of arms on the shield, but in a very tricky manner, they put a mirror on the shield, a mirror on which the word tolerance was engraved, and whoever had a look at their shield, whoever was communicating with them, they basically saw themselves in the mirror with the imperative, be tolerant with me. Okay, so in this way, reciprocity was absolutely not practiced with the proponent of gender education. This was one of the main topics, tolerance. The other one that came up very frequently in the discussion was the admiration of the new. This is called neophilia. Philia, like liking something, and neophilia is when you appreciate something because it's new. And people who put their comments typically said that socially accepted norms are traditional and they are boring, they are dull, and the past is ridiculous, and we need to celebrate something which is new, something which is eccentric, something which is unconventional and non-conforming. Now then, one of the problems with neophilia, or with this idea of admiring something for the fact of being new, is that it works only if there is a majority who maintains a certain set of rules. Because if you don't have the majority keeping norms or sets of rules, then you don't have a reference point from which you can divert and from which you can depart. So the dissenting proposition presupposes that there is conformity. But what I didn't see in the discussion is that the non-conforming people, appreciating the existence of conforming people, they rather showed contempt and the lack of appreciation of conformity. Now, then the other problem with non-conforming attitude with following this line of neophilia is that if the novelty itself is what we celebrate, then we always pass on from one thing to the other, because what is new today is going to be old by tomorrow. So there is a continuous transgression, and we can never stop, and we can never settle. And it's very problematic with values, because if you change your values continuously, then society is not going to be held together by a common set of values. The other important thing here is that those who were celebrating novelty in itself never questioned the quality of the new. So they never had the question whether the new is any better, in any ways better than the old. So what we will end up here with this idea of neophilia and continuous transgression is that something doesn't need to be outstanding to be celebrated. It simply needs to be new. So there is not going to be the weighing whether something is beneficial for society, if it's an exceptional cultural product or not, because the novelty itself is what creates the value. And this is what you see in the gender movement. As Ashley said, originally we had the LGB, and then it grew into an LGBT, and then the Q was added, Q at that time for queer, and then LGBTQ grew into an LGBTQI, completely mixing up attitudes, sexual orientation, gender identity, and biological facts with the I, with the intersex. And then it moved on to contain LGBTQIA, the asexual, and fairly recently after the A you might add a number as well, the 2S for the two-spirited. And I wonder when we finish the discussion how long the sequence grows, but I'm sure that it's never gonna stop because there is no end to it, because there is no point to reach with it. Now then, focusing on these two main topics, on the proponents of gender education for children, let's move on to the other side. Those who were against gender education for children typically argued by saying that nature is important. They wanted to have harmony with nature, and by nature here they meant the biological sexes. And the comments given within this reasoning, they actually accepted the idea of gender as long as gender meant the social roles associated for a woman to be a woman and a man to be a man. So actually the concordance with being a socially well-functioning person, concordance with the social function and the biological characteristics was highly appreciated, and many of the commenters actually called for the importance of gender education for children, saying that it's not enough to be born female. People need to, I mean, ladies or young girls need to learn how to behave as a young girl and as a young lady later on, or to be a woman. So they were saying that it's not self-evident, but it needs to be passed on, and it can be part of the curriculum as long as there is no mismatch, or there is no mixing of the two, referring to social role and biologically given characteristics. Now then, the idea of discomfort came up very, very frequently in the discussion, and especially with the idea that some of the people who don't feel well in their bodies, who feel discomfort with being a male or a female, they suffered from cognitive and affective distress, which is in medical terms called gender dysphoria. Now then, the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, collected by or compiled by the APA, American Psychiatric Association, categorizes gender dysphoria among mental disorders related to sexual and gender disorders. The point here is that gender dysphoria is a mental disorder, clinically speaking, and the medical categorization is a condition which is actually an illness of the mind. And in the discussion, those who were against gender education for children, gender dysphoria, they never used this word, but they were referring to the condition. Gender dysphoria was seen as an effect rather than the cause. And it's important to see, because if it's an effect, then what the people who didn't like the idea of gender education for children, they were wishing this condition to be changed so that the children acquire social norms which fit their body. And the discussion was proposing that stable and very simple concepts should be given to children, because if we give vague ideas, then they are going to be confused by those. Now then, what we see here is that the opponents of gender education for children didn't see the problem, gender dysphoria, as a cause. And they didn't recognize it as a benchmark or a reference point. So they didn't want to alter the situation according to this. And that's why they very strongly were against any sort of medical transitioning, whether hormone therapy or surgery or any other sort of medical treatment to give transitioning to the children. Now then, in the discussion, social roles were questioned, whether they are absolutely culture dependent, so-called socially constructed or not. And when the idea of social construction came up, basically what was meant is arbitrariness. So if there is a social role associated to a woman, is it any arbitrary, or is it socially constructed, or is it natural? Now then we need to see that even if there are different roles associated to women in different societies, if you take one single society and investigate it in time, back in history, even if you see the differences do not mean that they are arbitrary. And to show this, I'd like you to remind of the so-called kibbutz experiment, which is actually not an experiment, but a way of life. Back at the beginning of the 20th century, a voluntary community of international community got together to get an egalitarian way of living. They wanted to have absolutely equal social roles, an equal way of life. I wouldn't say equal rights, but equal way of life, because what they were trying to do in the kibbutz is to have an equal, to have a similar way of living, so that women didn't have specific jobs to carry out, and they were doing the same as men in a kind of a rotary system. So if you take a longer period of time, then everybody was doing everything. So everybody was doing basically the same kind of things. With this, they were trying to avoid the so-called patriarchal system. But what we saw by the third generation, so around the 60s, 1960s, third generation, which means the second in kibbutz-born generations, is that women started to protest. And they said that they want to have more time with their own children. They needed to have time with the family, meaning children, raising children. And on the other hand, they wanted to have light work or light physical work done. They didn't like working on the farm, which was too heavy physical work for them. And they said that men are stronger, so why isn't it men doing strong work on the farm? So that was in the 60s. And actually their protest was successful in a way that they changed the system. And even these days, those who live on a voluntary basis in a kibbutz, women tend not to work in the industrial sector or the agriculture or economic part of living. And if we consider the framing of the arguments of the women back in the 1960s, is what they were saying is they want to have their natural needs. Okay, so what you see here is that social roles are not completely arbitrary, but they stem from the natural needs, the natural biological facts that men and women are different. Now then, the next main type of argumentation within the discussion of those who were against gender education for children contained duties. And here, let me just call your attention to running out of time? A little bit. Okay, just a few sentences on this, and then I'll leave out the next bit and try to conclude. Okay, so the people here were not talking about rights, but they were talking about duties of the parents, duties and responsibilities of the parents with bringing up their children. And one of the duties, they mentioned two types of duties for the parents. One of the duties was providing an environment which is protective. Protective in what sense? Protective so that the psychological and moral development of the child is ensured, and the child is not exposed to any sexual attribution or sexualization or sexuality, or that the child doesn't need to make decisions about life choices at a very early age. Now then, about these duties, we had a referendum back in 2022 in Hungary. not going into the details because we are running out of time. Just to tell you very shortly that the majority of Hungarian society, so 95% of the electorate, said that they don't want children to be exposed to workshops which give sexual education or sexual orientation at schools without the consent of the parents. Now, then the other important duty of the parents in the discussion that came up is tradition. Tradition in the sense that parents are responsible to pass on the values that they were given, that they received from their parents and grandparents and forefathers, so that so-called tested models is passed on, because we've got long generations of the same system, same family model going on. So what we can be sure is that this is a working model, and it's the role and duty of the parents to pass on these values. So what you see here is that the opponents of gender education for children saw a continuity of society. So they didn't just see an individual in opposition or of society, or an individual within society, but they saw society itself as a dynamic term in an organic link of the past. And because of that feeling of organic link of the past, they were actually having a feeling of responsibility for the future. Right, and then I will stop here and not give you any more examples, but let's go on with the discussion.
Thank you to the both of you. I think we've heard some very interesting points and some overlaps, but a lot of many different dimensions. And since you're both experts on controversial issues, I would like to start with a provocative question. Do you think that sexual education or gender education for children, is this a form of child abuse?
No, I think we need to be careful about these kinds. This is what I'm saying. Like, we just keep ratcheting it up, you know? Like, we can't have any discussion. So it's like there's groomers and pedophiles on this side, and it's child abuse, and it's crazy. Come on, we need to be able to find a solution here. There, you know, something like how we educate the next generation is a question for society to answer. And there are going to be disagreements. And when people just, as I say, like roll over other people, like bulldoze over other people, then you wind up with this kind of hysteria. Oh, you're abusing children and so on. And then, oh, well, no, you're passing on these harmful stereotypes and quashing individuality, all of this. I think when it comes to education, we have to be able to discuss and decide as a society. And it doesn't mean that everyone's going to be happy at the end of the day. But we have to find some workable solution that allows us to live together and that allows us to educate the next generation in the norms and values, the range of them that exist. And we also have to trust that when they grow up and become adults, they will be able to exercise judgment about which values they're going to live by. And I think part of the reason why we want to bulldoze over everybody is because we don't think that that's true. We think whatever somebody learns in childhood, that's it. No one ever changes their mind. Then democracy is an illusion. And that's a really scary, but we've been there before, saying democracy is an illusion, and no one is, you know, fascists would say 1,000 empty heads think that they have thoughts, but they're just being led by a demagogue. That's what fascists said. Now, obviously, I'm taking it to extremes, but I'm just saying, when we lose faith in democracy, we are losing faith in the ability of our society to progress in peaceful ways. It's a dangerous position to be in.
Thank you very much. Nátalia, do you have comments on that?
Yeah, I think this is something like tolerance. You cannot, I don't know if it works or... Yeah, it's working. Okay. So you cannot use it without content. I mean, sexual education, what does that mean? What do we want to educate? Gender education, what do we want to educate? So if you just overgeneralize it, and then you make it an empty concept, and an empty concept, I would say, is not an abuse, but if you put some different content in it. It might be sexual abuse. It might not. It depends what we mean by that.
Thank you. So actually you talked about legitimation, in fact both of you did, and how, you know, policy comes from somewhere without public support, and it's a way to re-educate the public in a way. And yet, Nátalia, you mentioned that when the Hungarian referendum was conducted, people have expressed their views very clearly. So does it seem like we have a working democracy in Hungary, and some other countries might not have?
Okay, it's interesting to see that in Hungary we had the referendum. I don't know if any other countries have ever done that, so it's very unique that we have the referendum. Now then, obviously those who don't like, I mean, those who would like to have gender education for children, they give many ways of explaining away the very high % of people saying no to the no to gender education. But what we see is that those who went and voted, very few of them said a clear yes. And the percentage didn't even reach 3% of society. So if you have a look at it, then we have data about how much the electorate, that is adult people, support, or rather say oppose the idea of gender education.
Mm-hmm.
I think in other countries, democracy is definitely struggling for the reasons that I said before. We don't really have faith in the people, that they can be trusted, that they exercise judgment, they can make up their minds, that they can be convinced, or it's worth trying to convince them. It's absolutely a lost cause, you know. It's become a cliche that there's just no point. No one ever changes their mind, as I said. But I think also when the big questions of society appear to be answered, we get more and more of these conflicts over values and people going on these symbolic crusades, which is the name of the book that I was talking about with Joseph Gusfield. It's a very good one. It's an old one from the 60s. But so one thing that he talks about is that part of the reason why alcohol became such a big issue was because all the other issues seemed to be settled. And so it opened up this space in society to argue about what people consumed and what people now do with their bodies and this sort of thing. This becomes one of the big things that we debate, or that we disallow debate on, or that become symbols of progress, because we can't seem to make progress maybe in other areas. The big issues seem quite resistant to change, you know, the perennial issues of our society, like who gets what, you know, poverty, inequality, these things seem really resistant. And so you have this sort of neophilia where it's like, well, I can't solve that problem, but maybe I can celebrate this new thing. Maybe I can find a new kind of inequality to get excited about, and then I'll have done something. So I think that's kind of it's a more complex situation than saying, oh, this country has a better democracy than this. I think what's happening in our democratic societies is that once you kind of take certain questions and put them off the table, that's it. These things can't be debated. They're just decided. That's how society is run. Then it opens up the space for these kinds of value conflicts.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I think we can open up now the questions to the audience, because we're a little bit behind time. So would you have any questions to our speakers? Yes?
To yourself, you were talking about let's say, the growth in the LGBTIQ, 2QA, whatever, two spirits, what was it?
Which is funny, all this talk of cultural appropriation, no one ever talks about how that's appropriated from indigenous culture. Anyway, go on.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, just as it's increased, and you were talking about the use of the language of tolerance without an object not being clear. And when you think about, they used to say that some virtues are in the extremes, others are in the middle, the via media, whatever. And I think it would be a good idea to ask people, like, are you tolerant, for example, of are we going towards a situation with this gender ideology where P starts to appear and pedophilia that we are asked to tolerate as people? Are you tolerant of pedophilia? Where is all this stuff? And when you look, I would say one of the lacking things in the first talk was without a history of looking at gender ideology, who started it, where did the language come from, be it Alfred Kinsey, Dr. John Money, Michel Foucault, where did it all, the beginning is the kind of oak in the seed that the guys who started this ideas and what later became like an ideology, but they seem to be pretty happy with pedophilia, and they were the ones preaching tolerance, endless tolerance. So do you think that that is where, with the whole gender ideology pushing the indoctrination and mutilation of young children to destroy their bodies, is that where it's leading to?
Well, I cannot see cannot foresee the future, so I don't know where it's going to stop or if it's going to stop ever. But what you can see with, for example, with pedophilia, with the P, in some of the sequences I've seen the P, and some people already celebrate P along with the other letters. And we need to be very careful with the language, because if for some people who think about pedophilia as something that they don't want, then the language helps, because we've got our ideas already, what it actually means physically, or what kind of physical action it means. But if the term is changed, and that's something I've seen, instead of pedophilia, you've got, sorry?
Minor attractive person used by the Commission 2 years ago.
Yeah, okay, so if you've got euphobophilia, euphebos in Greek is young boy, then people will not hear what it actually means, and it's going to be detached from reality. So what I think here is important is to keep to physical reality, to physical reality as close as possible, because if we invent a new language, then the language can live its own way and own life, and it can be kind of a narration which is detached from reality, and it can create absolutely new and different things that we actually don't want.
Can I say, I actually don't think that will happen. I know people have tried. Like, once they had that doorway open, they started to try to change the language. But it's interesting because people will, in the same breath, kind of say young people, children can choose their gender identity, but then they will turn around and condemn a relationship with a large age gap. And they'll say, oh, well, the younger person, there's a power differential and all this sorts of things. That's a very common thing now, is to sort of problematize relationships with large age gaps. And I think the common thread is this idea that we harm each other. So I feel like pedophilia is probably a pretty deep one in our society that would take a lot to dislodge, partially because there's this idea of harm, but also in this, but also in this discourse, there's this sense that when you impose your will on somebody else in any way, it is by definition negative. So that's why they will champion this, what is a very individualized kind of discourse. So when it comes to relationships, people are a lot more iffy, right? They're celebrating a kind of internal relationship one has with oneself. And that's far less problematic to them. And I think that explains why they're able to say a young person can choose their gender identity but can't choose a relationship with an adult, rightly so. But the reason is because they have an idea of harm, and just generally, not even just pedophilia, obviously. That's an obvious harm. But I mean, they have an idea of like, when we impose our will on someone else, it's a bad thing. And this kind of thing is just, it's a relationship with yourself. And that's something that it's sacred in a way. So I think it's a totally different thing. I really don't think pedophilia will be able to piggyback on this. I could be wrong.
Thank you,
Can I
Ursula.
just
Let's
add something to this?
I garbled that, but you get what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm actually very happy to hear that you are so optimistic. What I see is if you are clever enough, I mean, if you create a nice narrative, then I think with this idea of transgression, with the idea of passing on to the new terrain, something which is completely new, I think with a nice narrative you can create basically anything. If you have a look at the history of the LGBTQI, whatever, plus minus movement, then it started with actually not the L, not the lesbian, but with the gay, so with the G. It's a different issue why we've got the letter L at the beginning, but it all started with the gay movement, and the language of the gay movement was created. And once the language was created, it became so much accepted that I guess most people in Western Europe and the USA would say that homosexual relationship is absolutely normal. Now then, in the Hungarian language, the word that's used for homosexuals is not gay. I mean, gay in English gives a positive image, somebody who is happy, who is brilliant and shining. Now then, in Hungarian, we use the German origin verb, and it's once again important, it refers to the action. So whenever we refer to the person who is gay, then the image of the physical action comes to our mind. So in Hungarian, it's a bit more difficult to change the narrative unless you use homosexual, but that's not a Hungarian word, so it's not so much part of the discourse.
Thank you. Frank has a question.
I never have a question. I know everything. I think that there is a danger in getting fixated with pedophilia because it means that we miss out far more dangerous problems that I'm much more worried about. I think that the thing that we need to be worried about is, first of all, the imminent adultification of children and the infantilization of adults, which is the erosion of line between children and adults, which is implied by this, which has become increasingly entrenched in, particularly in the Anglo-American world, and has got very powerful cultural drivers to it, which has the effect of completely messing people up mentally and physically, with very, very kind of confusing consequences. That's what we should be worried about, number one. Number two, what we should really be worried about, and there's nothing, to me, more distressing than when young children, you know, if you take the World Health Organization's position on this, from the age of 3, 4, 5, 6, you know, we should be teaching children about masturbation. We should be teaching children about essentially aspects of our lives which used to be confined to adults. In other words, we're recycling adult preoccupations about sex through the medium of children. That's what we should be worried about, because what that does is it creates a tremendous degree of confusion, what psychologists call an identity crisis, which is very, very difficult to resolve. And so what I'm really worried about is that children who grow up according to this regime end up finding it difficult to make the transition to adulthood. And you find that in almost every Western world, people become adults later and later and later. In America now, they have different stages that they've introduced, but adults, full adults, become adults when they're 35, 36, which is really weird. And as a result of that, you know, I think that's what we should be worried about. And I think Ashley's got a point, and her point is that if we become if we just become the caricatures of what the other side wants us to be, you know, they call us homophobic, transphobic, I mean, whatever. And if we just simply react to that by picking at their weakest point, which is pedophilia, then we end up losing the battle, because their strong points are elsewhere, you know, where they're proceeding, where they're making an impact, where they're capturing the minds of young people is on all those areas where at the moment people on our side are not really responding. They're getting distracted by the relatively easy arguments. And experience shows that if you do that, and we become caricatures as well, we will lose this culture war. And that's not something that we can afford to do, because we have already lost 3 generations, at least 3.5 generations of young people. If you lose another generation of young people in this battle, then I think that we got a mega crisis on our hands, which will become very difficult to come out of. And therefore, the key thing for us is to, in essence, do whatever we can to fight the sexualization of childhood, fight this adultification of children, say no to sexuality education. I think it's legitimate for children to learn about biology, what in English we call the birds and the bees. That's quite a normal thing to do, but not about sexual identity and not about the sexualized forms of teaching. And I think that's a strong position that we can use to defeat our opponents with. And that's really where we should put our energies into.
Any comments on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think the point that I was trying to make in addition to that was that there's a tendency to be skeptical of relationships in general, which is why I think it'll never go to pedophilia. So there's a skepticism of like parent-child relationships. There's a skepticism of relationships with age gaps. There's a skepticism about consent, all of these sorts of things that are bound up with a lot of these culture wars. And I think with education, I agree completely that obviously we need to teach about the birds and the bees, this sort of thing. But one thing that really intrigues me is for a movement that supposedly is so constructionist, supposed to be a social constructionist, relativist movement, truth is relative and so on. They have a very inflexible, solid understanding of psychology. Right, so you teach about this sort of sexualities and all these sorts of things when people are young out of this belief that there's something firm and inflexible there, that you just have to teach the child about it. Then through that language, they will discover who they are, as opposed to creating something. And that's the thing about humanity. We are so incredibly malleable and flexible. And that's part of the reason why we're actually having some of these debates, is because our gender roles are loosening up. Things that we thought were just natural and determined by nature no longer seem that way. And we need to have a discussion about how we're going to live together. How are we going to take care of our children? How are we going to socialize them into the next generation when it's no longer given by tradition? But what's interesting is that in the face of that, where all that is solid seems to be melting into air, people seem to be searching for something firm, and they find it in childhood. You know, so we got to go in and like give young people this vocabulary, and then they will discover themselves. And I'm just sitting here thinking, like, what do you think that a child walks out of the womb thinking that they're sapiosexual? No, that's something that our culture, and it might be a useful thing. Sure, perhaps it's something that people find a useful label for themselves. It's a caricature, obviously, but that is something that is very social and very cultural. And I think, ironically, biology suddenly becomes very ephemeral, and things like identity become very firm. And I think it's this sort of symptom of a kind of situation that we're in, and our inability to reckon with it when all you can say is like 5 different statements on the topic, you know, some mantras that you can say to avoid really digging in and saying, well, you know, what it means to be human is actually not determined from birth, and we have got to figure out how we're going to live in that kind of situation.
Thank you, Ashley. Do you have anything to add to that, Nátalia?
It was nice and complex.
Perfect. We have a question from Christian in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting debate and presentations. And the topic is very important because we just had a strong debate at the beginning of May in the European Parliament about the Istanbul Convention. And that is the first, based on my knowledge, the first international document that was transposing to law, that it's actually introducing this term of gender identity into legal field. In other words, people will be criminalized for different kind of infractions in regards to gender identity. And now the question that I want to address is from the perspective of a lawmaker, because when we pass laws, the laws, one of the characteristics of a law, it has to be public. The other one, it has to be clear. So the terms, the words, the vocabulary that we use when we write a law, it has to define clear realities. So especially when you talk about infractions and about penalizing, criminally certain actions, someone has to know how to conduct in a way that will not violate the law. That's the reason why the law has to be clear. And what I've seen happening from my perspective is, I will not even call it these lefties, because it's not a matter of left or right. It's a matter of right and wrong. But it's, they are changing the words in a way that is creating or rephrasing something that was seen right for so long in something that is clearly wrong. And we have to find a way how to explain it to the people on one side, but on the other side also to know, let's say in the European Parliament, how to react to it. Because we keep talking about gender identity. This could be a very good cultural debate, like we do right now. But is this a legal debate? Can we put into a law something that is related to gender identity? Because that's something that you have. If you want to consider yourself, I gave this example in the parliament, a car. If you want to consider yourself a car, do we give you a license plate instead of an ID card? They left, but this is the reality that we live in. When we pass laws, in Romania, for example, we don't mention in the law identity. We mention identification. In California or in many US states, when you have a card, it's not called identity card, it's called identification card. And there's a difference between identity and identification. You can call yourself and claim yourself to be whatever you want. I don't care. Hypothetically speaking, I can accept that you have the right to consider yourself a rock. But from my perspective as a member of the European Parliament, do I have to pass a law to put on an ID card the fact that you are a rock? And if you're a rock, what kind of rock? Or do we use the law to actually define the kind of relationships that we have in a way that will identify ourselves in order to know who we are in regards to each other? So, for example, when you pass the border, Romania is not in Schengen, for example. So when I come from Romania here, or you go from outside of EU and you come in, you have to cross the border checkpoint, right? So they look at your passport and they look at you. If we accept this premise that we pass laws based on who you think you are, can I put another picture, for example, on the passport? Where do we stop with this madness? So I think this is where you guys from the academia have to come up and help us to define these problems, because we see it. I mean, for us, especially for us in the ECI group or ID group, who are kind of reasonable with these things, it's unbelievable, because you open a can of worms where you have all these laws.
Christian, thank you so much. I think we understood. We'll just get responses to this and then we'll wrap up. So do you have anything to?
Yeah, well, I'd like to do that, but in order to do that, I need to not be like hounded out of polite society and threatened with, losing my job, never working again, this kind of thing, for simply saying we should have a debate about some of these things. I haven't even said anything, just for saying we should have a debate about these things. Like a lot of these questions, I don't have an answer. They're really complicated, difficult questions. And I have trans students who I care about and I'm worried about. There has to be a sane way forward that doesn't mean we just crush this person and what they want out of their lives. We're rolling back even on that. Like we had like a tacit kind of acceptance for like 20 years that if someone passed as the opposite sex, you kind of treated them that way. And now you have people saying like, oh no, I have a responsibility to say, you know, to call you a he because I have a responsibility toward the truth or whatever. So I have a responsibility to ask what's in your pants and this sort of thing. But that's backwards from where we were even 20 years ago. These are really complicated questions, really, really complicated questions about how do we move forward. You know, you can't sort of coerce people to get medical transitions. That's a tough thing, right? But you also can't have someone who's clearly a man go into a women's bathroom because the women there won't like that, right? These are things that have to be negotiated, and we're not doing that. So what we end up with is what I'm talking about, coercive reforms, where you just criminalize the opposition. And you make it more and more possible to have any kind of sane policy, and then you just ratchet up, right? Just the opposition gets crazier and crazier. You know, they're groomers and this sort of thing. And then the other side wants more and more extreme things. This is not good for anyone. We've got there must be some sane way where somebody can just live their life as they please, and the rest of us can too. But we have to debate it. I have to be able to speak openly, and other people who have an opposing opinion, we've got to be able to just have it out and disagree. And I think we can find these solutions, but we got to stop trying to crush each other.
Thank you, Ashley. Nátalia?
I think when we want to change a system, then the discussion itself is okay, it's the beginning, but we need to see the whole system together. Your funny example with the car and the car plate reminded me of the pronouns, which is in the Western world, it became absolutely common and typical for people to choose their pronouns. And some of my colleagues working in Western Europe end their letters by a confirmation of what kind of pronouns they wish to be used. And this is a point which is linguistically speaking absurd, because the pronoun, the set of pronouns is a set of reference of point for something which is universally recognizable. So when I use a pronoun, for example, he for Frank, then I can use it because I see whatever I see that he's a man. And even if somebody believes himself or herself to be someone else, then the people who talk about him shouldn't be using anything else but what they see, because then the pronoun loses the point of its reference. So basically loses its function. And I think in cases like that, a debate or a discussion is not even needed, because we can see that any sort of change here would just undermine the system. So if you put any sort of alterations to the pronoun system, then you will lose the system itself. And I think it's the same with the car and the car plate and identification. When the law talks about a person, then it's the person seen from the outside, seen from the point of society and not from the inside. It's not the individual understanding of myself or individual kind of approach to myself.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to close this debate. Thank you for your inputs, and thank you to our great speakers. We have a next event coming up next week, and I'd like to ask my colleague John to talk a little bit about that.
Good evening. I just want to let you know about an event that will be taking place next Thursday, the 15th of June at 7 o'clock here in Brussels. For several years, a scandal rocked the United Kingdom. At the heart of the scandal lies a series of organized criminal gangs who were systematically abusing young women in a number of cities across the UK. Most shockingly, there was credible complaints that the abuse of girls had been overlooked because of the ethnicity of many of the perpetrators, who were predominantly Pakistani. Many claim that local councils, the police, and even journalists were reluctant to intervene because they were scared of being accused of racism. It seems that political correctness may be escalated from the regulation of language to affect policing, judicial, and administrative services. Charlie Peters is one of the very few journalists in the UK dare to investigate this very difficult issue. His documentary, Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, tells the story of these grooming gangs, the scandal behind it, and interviews with survivors. We'll be showing that movie, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss with Charlie his investigation and what he learned from it. It won't be live streamed. It's an in-person event with the filmmaker. I hope you will join us. It's in conjunction with the List Institute here in Brussels. I hope to see you then. Thank you very much.